Senator Cornyn, thank you for joining us. Thanks for sticking around.
Great to be with you.
Clearly, the biggest news coming out of D.C. this month is, of course, the U.S. finally sending aid overseas to our allies. You had a big role in convincing certain factions of your party that this was important and finally getting it across to President Biden's desk. I'm wondering, between Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, how you were able to bridge the gaps between some Republicans wanting to focus on Israel. How were you able to convince your party that this is all one package that needs to go together?
Well, I think Speaker Johnson helped with a big vote in the House, a big bipartisan vote in the House. But as the saying goes, history does have a tendency to repeat itself. And what we've seen happen in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, now going on for 2 years, my concern is that something like that could not only endanger the Ukrainians, who obviously are fighting for their survival as an independent democracy, but also spread to other parts of Europe and become part of a regional or bigger war. And so I think it's really important to help support our allies. We actually had an agreement with the Ukrainians dating back to 1994 called the Budapest Memorandum. They had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, but gave them up in exchange for guarantees to help protect their sovereignty. So I believe we have a lot of self-interest. This is in our national interest to do this, but we also have an obligation based on that treaty to come to their aid.
Tangential to the Taiwan conversation as well is, of course, the CHIPS Act. Mm-hmm. The United States is worried that with the concentration of chips in Taiwan, that may make our supply lines to those chips falter if China were to move into Taiwan as well. Explain your role in bringing so much of that CHIPS Act money to Texas, and why you think Texas is the proper host for that Samsung plant that we saw just last week.
Well, it's very encouraging to see what's happening here in Texas, and you're right. Their concern was mainly about the vulnerability of a supply chain of the most advanced semiconductors, which basically make everything that has an off and on switch work. Technology has become so much ingrained in our lives, and only about 12% of those advanced semiconductors were made in the United States. Most of them were made over in Asia. And after COVID, when we became aware of the fact that there was so much manufactured in China and overseas that would be vulnerable if there's another pandemic or a natural disaster, or heaven forbid a military conflict broke out, it's like a light switch went off in my head that, hey, we need to do something about this. So I had to learn, with the help of my great staff, more about semiconductors, because I'm certainly not an expert. But once I learned how indispensable they were to our country to maintain that supply chain, I knew that Texas was the place to do this. One, because we have great companies like Samsung here, which is now going to make a $40 billion investment in Central Texas. Obviously, that's going to create a lot of new jobs and opportunities, but also demands on our educational institutions to produce the educated workforce to be able to fill those good, well-paying jobs. So to me, it was a very important piece of legislation, and one that's, I think, paying great dividends.
Whether we're talking about foreign aid or the CHIPS Act, those are both fault lines within today's Republican Party, right? Especially in the House, but your fellow Senator Ted Cruz also opposed those measures. Do you worry about the fractures in the Republican Party now when it comes to these priorities of yours? And how can Senate Republicans come together on a more unified basis?
Well, you know, I represent 30 million people, and they don't all think alike. I try to listen to them and what they're telling me about what they want me to do on their behalf. But I also think it's my responsibility to share with them what I've learned in my job, for example, on national security matters. I'm a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. I go into a secure facility a couple times a week and review classified material, which educates me, just like the president has his presidential daily intelligence briefing, on what the national security threats are to the country. And some of those I can talk about publicly, and some of them I can't. But it's my job to, number one, to listen, and number two, to explain what I'm hearing and also why I'm voting the way I am. And that's what elections are for.
This all plays into the race for the next GOP leader as well, of course. You are in that race as part of what has become colloquially known in Washington as the Three Johns, right? How do you come out as the top John? And give us some insight into the state of that. I know it's a long way away, but where are we in that race right now?
Well, I definitely want to be the top John. But in all seriousness, these leadership races are very unusual because it's all the members, Republican members of the Senate. And we hope that after this next election, there'll be more of us and we'll be in the majority. But I've been in the Senate a long time now, and I've seen the Senate work well, where we actually work on a bipartisan basis to pass important national security legislation and to address real problems like the CHIPS Act, for example, and like this National Security Supplemental did. And I'd like to see the Senate back working again. Right now, under the current management, under Senator Schumer, basically most of the legislation is cooked up in his conference room and then brought to the floor of the Senate where there's no chance to amend it or improve it, and your only choice is to vote yes or no. So I think we can make the Senate work better in the best interest of all 30 million of us here in Texas and the rest of the country as well.
I assume your aspirations for leader mean you're in this for another term.
Yes.
Attorney General Ken Paxton, who is the job you used to have, has not so subtly implied that he may like to challenge you in a primary if you run again. Are you worried about a threat from a Paxton primary?
I sleep very well at night, so I'm not too worried about it. My last election, I had a primary. I had several primary opponents, and I got 76% of the vote. And so I realized I'm not going to get 100% of the vote, and contested primaries actually make you a better candidate in the general election, in my experience. So no, I'm not too worried about it, and that's still quite a ways off. And I guess a lot of it is speculative. It's not.
Sure.
It's not real yet.
Do you have a working relationship with the Attorney General, though? I know y'all like to spar on Twitter quite a bit, but are you productive in any work you may have to discuss together?
Well, there's a lot we agree on, and you know, having held that job for 4 years as the chief law enforcement officer for the state, I have strong feelings about how that job should be performed. But now my job is different, and it's to represent all of us here in Texas and work with all of our elected officials, including the Attorney General.
Speaker Johnson over in the House, of course, is still facing threats from some members of the minority faction of his Republican Party to oust him over foreign aid and other things. How has, in your mind, Congress run since Johnson took the helm? Do you think he's handling the intricacies of the House well?
Well, Speaker Johnson's like the guy who got thrown in the deep end of the swimming pool, and he's learned how to dog paddle, and now he's learned how to swim, and I think he's actually doing an outstanding job. I also think he's demonstrated a lot of personal political courage. You mentioned some of the challenges to the speakership that may still ensue, but that's what leadership is, where people they educate themselves about the issues, and they explain what it is, that they are doing and why they're doing it. And I think with the big vote you saw both in the House and in the Senate on this National Security Supplemental, for example, that he's demonstrated great leadership. I wish him continued success.
You know, our own House Speaker here in Texas has faced his fair share of challenges too, facing enormous opposition from Donald Trump, from Ken Paxton trying to oust him. He has a runoff in about a month. How have you seen the House here in Texas work to pass conservative priorities? Are you satisfied with Dade Phelan's leadership, or are you getting involved in any of these runoffs?
Well, I think it's a truism that when Republicans or any political party are divided, the main people that benefit from it is your opposition party. So I hate to see Republicans on Republican contests, but again, that's what primaries are for. And my admonition would be, after these primaries are over, let's get unified, because the big contest is going to be in November, particularly with Senator Cruz's race. I'm doing everything I can to help Ted. He had a relatively close race back in 2018, and I know there's going to be an incredible amount of money coming from out of state to try to defeat him. So I'm doing everything I can to be helpful to him, and I'm pretty confident he's going to be successful.
You think Colin Allred poses a real threat?
Well, I think until people realize what percentage of the time Mr. Allred has voted with President Biden, which is pretty close to 100% of the time, And those policies are not particularly popular here in Texas. So I think there's a big disconnect between the image that he's trying to project and what actually people will eventually learn about his record and what he's done in Washington, D.C.
One last policy question, then we'll get you out of here. SB 4, border security, right? Held up in the courts. Is there any hope or is there any chance that Washington may pass border security legislation before this election?
Well, I don't think so. Unfortunately, any laws that we pass depend on the executive branch, that is the President of the United States, to actually enforce. And President Biden has shown himself unwilling to enforce even current laws on the books. They're basically the same laws that were in place when President Trump was in office, but with very different outcomes. And President Biden has tried to dismantle all of the things like the Remain in Mexico policy, which has proved to be effective in the 4 years that President Trump was in office. So I think the real solution to this is not passing more laws that will go unenforced. It is to get a new president who will actually enforce the laws and secure the border.
There's an idea in some parts of the Republican Party that President Biden's handling of the border is not a policy disagreement or even mismanagement, but it is a deliberate attempt to bring in new Democratic voters. Your colleague Ted Cruz supported that position when I talked to him about this as well. Yeah. Do you agree?
Well, you know, I was skeptical for a while, but now, you know, you look for explanations. How is it that you can tolerate about 9 million people coming across the border illegally? 108,000 Americans dying of drug overdoses as a result of drugs that come across the border. 400,000 children, unaccompanied children, placed with sponsors here in the United States and simply lost by the Biden administration. You begin to wonder what could be going through people's minds? What are they thinking? And I run out of reasons for explaining the Biden administration policies other than what you just mentioned. I think it's going to backfire. Obviously, Hispanics are voting more and more Republican because they understand the importance of a controlled, humane, and legal system of immigration. That's what's made our state and our country great. Uncontrolled immigration and outsourcing that to the cartels has been an unmitigated disaster. Mm-hmm. So I think we're all scratching our heads and trying to figure out why would President Biden do such a singularly miserable job of actually enforcing the law? And I think we've kind of run out of reasons.
This could be a long-term strategy to bring in Democratic voters, although immigrants like that cannot vote. Do you believe that?
Well, we actually had a vote. Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee basically said that introduced an amendment that said you could not count non-citizens for purposes of the Electoral College or for reapportionment, that is, creating the new congressional districts. And every single Democrat voted against it. And you began to wonder, here again, what's the message that they're trying to send here? I also think part of this has to do with President Biden's afraid of his own progressive base, the peoples like AOC and others, the squad. And so he's unwilling to stand up to them, and so he's willing to accept that this chaos and disaster that we're seeing at the border.
Does Donald Trump have a role, though, in encouraging Republican voters to wait on border security legislation?
Well, I think he said as much, and I think he realizes that this is a matter of lack of will to enforce the laws that are on the books. And he believes, and I actually agree with him, that the solution is going to be to vote for Donald Trump in November as part of the solution to the border problem. Obviously, if you voted for Biden, you'd get more of the same, which has been, as I said, an unmitigated disaster.
Last question. Your wife's brisket, you're very proud of it. Is it really as good as you say?
It's better. It's better. It's funny how things like that provoke such an outcry.
The brisket wars have really stoked on Twitter.
It was really interesting because different people said they prefer a different recipe, and I said, well, this is just a indication of how diverse Texans are, that all the different ways they enjoy their brisket, which we all enjoy. But I saw something that I thought really went beyond the pale the other day when Texas Monthly, for example, had a recipe for enchilada meatloaf.
I did see that.
To me, that's...
I didn't think it looked that bad. I saw that you shared that.
Well,
I thought I would try it.
I like my meatloaf as much as the next guy, but an enchilada meatloaf? Give me a break.
All right, Senator, thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely.